There are so many empires located in West Africa that you could invent a dictionary of them in the Middle Ages. But I think this misses a point that is very important. We can talk about the Songhai, the Asante, we can talk about the Kingdom of Mali, we can talk about, Janae, we could talk about all kinds of places around West Africa and Central West Africa, which developed this high level of civilization, which competed against each other, was literate, had gold, continued to change the world throughout, had people visiting it as far from China and India, landing in that specific region, had people from that empire moving all the way to China at the same time. The problem with this is that you can't start here. Starting with this is like starting the history of Egypt with the invasion of Islam, or for that matter, starting the history of Arabia, the Arabian areas, with Muhammad. The history goes back further than this, and it speaks volume. It actually speaks deeply about how the people got to where they are. You see, there is an undermining of even the civilizations in that time because even though a lot of them built with stone, a lot of the important monuments built were built with mud. Why? Why would these people build with mud? The context is lost if you look at it from the point of, oh, yeah, because these people were still developing rocks by this period, using rocks as buildings and being able to cement them together and all this other stuff. This is a problem. The problem with this is that we do not see that history being displayed. For example, I've shown you the places of Ghana, I've shown you the places of Guinea Bissau and Nigeria, that these people already had the ability to do that thousands of years before they got there. Now, there is still places like the country Ghana, not the empire Ghana, where there is an important culture where we see three things at the exact same time. For the most part, buildings made in 2000 BC, made of mud brick and also some dry stone wall enclosures, similar to those of every other place in Central to Southern Africa. These stone walls show us that these people, this population in 2000 BC, was not running away, it was not moving away from rocks as the years went on, but instead it realized that in that specific location, using mud bricks is better. But let's, for a second, calm ourselves and look at it from a bigger point of view before I come back to exactly what is the culture that was alive and rooted in Ghana. In order to illustrate this point perfectly, what we need is to separate things. So, first, let us separate spaces. So, we do understand that, of course, we have the Sumerians far away from West Africa. Why am I bringing up the Sumerians? Well, it's because there's something called networks that we need to talk about. These networks are civilizations that connect to one another, even though they do not speak the same language or operate in the same way initially, but instead feed off of one another, creating a giant network that we can understand. So let's go back to the point I was saying about people in Egypt starting their history at about 600 BC. If you start the history 600 AD, when the Islamic invasion happened, if you started there and you start to trace it backwards from that point of view, it's no wonder people have so many misconceptions, talking about how women didn't have the freedom to go outside and work, talking about how, the heat and what modesty was, and all this thing about ancient Egypt and its history, collaborating its religion or mixing up its religion with the religion of the Sumerians. But the Sumerians do have a history that could be mixed up with something, with the Akkadians, even the Persians to some degree. These people, a giant network that work together, we can prove simply because they traded with one another, and when their languages started to rise, we see a conversion. Now, let us ask ourselves another question that is very important. Who are the Akkadians of ancient Egypt? For example, who are the people who were there to operate, to see what happened? It's the Nubians, of course, because the history of Egypt starts with the periods of 600 AD, and then we go backwards looking at it from how does it fit into today. What this does is it removes the Nubians who were there prior to the civilization of Egypt and after the civilization of Egypt. I'm going to say that again. Prior to the civilization of Egypt and after the civilization of Egypt. They flourish and they continue to flourish to this day. These people who we see did not get completely removed from Egypt itself. We see them spotted, dotted all over Egypt. Now, people don't know this. That's why I made the video, The Nubian Files, which you have to watch again in order to get the context back in your brain. And I made the video about the Punt and the Punt files. And the reason why I did this is because I want to show you how deep the history of these people are and how scattered they were in Egypt, both in their original form and in their tame form when they became Egyptian. So, what does this tell you? Well, this is why you have so many videos of people talking about Egypt, connecting Egypt to Sumeria, a civilization that does not connect at all, in any way, shape, or form, with the historical or the ancient civilization of Egypt. Connecting Egypt with Sumeria is insulting or it's overblown. There is some connection of trade, but it's so small. How can you disconnect the Nubian civilization but highlight people who live so far away? These people live in Egypt in different parts. If you watch the Nubian Files, it's people who live in the deserts of Egypt, in areas where the Egyptians don't even dare to go. They don't even try to civilize those regions. They just go, okay, those guys do what they do there. They use them in a sort of equal way, both of them, just exchanging like, okay, we'll guard this area, and then you guys will, in exchange, give us this, this, and that. Take this and apply it back to different parts of Africa. So if we go to West Africa, right, the context is lost. If you start with the Songhai, if you start with the Mali Empire, if you start with these already flourishing civilizations, and of course, the question would be if Mali or these areas were a person, where the hell did you just pop out from? Which is why, in context, people would be like, the reason why all of those places are so civilized is because of the Berbers, right? It's because some people in the Middle East moved all the way down and gave the civilization to these people living in West Africa. And what evidence do you have against this if you do not dig deep into 2000 BC? What evidence do you have against this if you do not look deeply into the history of West Africa and the networks that existed in the region and where they stop? If you notice where they stop, and they stop far, far into Africa, way before you get to Arabia, it tells you that there is no connection between the stone buildings of Africa, cloth making, and so many other things, metallurgy. There is no connection between these places and the fact that people in other parts of the world use these. Now, of course, there's some things that are symbolic in the head, and we associate things like camels and stuff like that with Arabia and the Middle East. And therefore, when we show Africans with camels running around in West Africa because of the change of the climate in that area, which is another important thing, if you do not mention that history, it will be lost. Then people will associate Africa with the Middle East. It's like, okay, these great empires are great, but they're associated with the Middle East. That's why they were so great. And you have nothing to push back against if you just start with these civilizations. But here's the thing, you know that the horse was first tamed in Africa before the camel was. So, in other words, horses that came from outside came and landed in West Africa way before the camel did. Why? Well, the reason for this is because the camel was not founded in West Africa, it was founded in East Africa. Two completely separate cultures. The camel was then moved into some parts of Central Africa, but it completely missed West Africa for the longest time. About 2000 or 1000 BC, we do see images of camels inside of Central Africa, but we don't see them in West Africa. And there's a reason for this. We see them in some cases in North Africa, but this shows you where the cutoff is. Now, why were camels suddenly important? Again, desertification. The camel is great for the desert. And this would be learned, or this would implant or get into the system of the West Africans later. But this is not the original culture. They had horses. They, to some degree, I mean, you can see with the pictures that I'd shown you before, they're chariots. They were riding high. The language of these people is another problem as well. This is why a lot of people don't believe in the Bantu migration and stuff like that. I literally listen to Nigerian people talk in their language, and every now and then I catch a word and I go look it up, and it's exactly the same word in my language, for example. Like I catch a word, they say it, and I'm like, there's no way he just said that. That sounds like, and then you look it up and they have the exact same meaning. And also, it's the context and how they put it in that makes me understand that. But a lot of people, they want to separate this history, of course, because they start at the wrong era. They start with the Songhai. You start with Songhai, you start with all of these other places, you're going to get the wrong answers. So if we had to separate different parts of Africa based not just on geography, but influence, we would put Libya, the country of today called Libya, with Egypt, and we would put Egypt with Sudan, and we would put Sudan with Ethiopia, and we would put Ethiopia with the Swahili coast. This is what we would do if we were being honest about what the networks are. So again, let's try it again. So East Africa, the Swahili coast, which at this time, 2000 BC, was not the Swahili coast. We see Kushites, people from Sudan all the way to Ethiopia in that region having influence. They're not moving in that region, but they have influence. There's some cases of very little groups of people, possibly from Ethiopia, moving down into that region. We also see, obviously, other groups that are moving throughout that region, the Khoisan people moving all the way to Kenya, moving all the way to Central Africa, and they're just running back and forth in this era in 2000 BC. We also see in Central Africa groups of people separating themselves. So, as a network, we put West Africa as one, North Africa, the part starting from Mauritania all the way till we get to Libya as another. They have these tumulus or tumulays. I don't know how to pronounce that word, but they have these things that are is consistent throughout their region, burials that are consistent throughout the region. And so, therefore, a secondary area that we would put is Mauritania, Ghana, and North Africa as a similar culture to some degree. Again, this has nothing to do with race, has nothing to do with whether the people there are pale or dark skinned. It's just culturally, they share some things in common. Okay, that's fine. So, what then? Well, then we move on from about 2000 BC. We go to 1500 BC. And from this period, we start seeing art. The art from this region is similar throughout the rest of Africa. You see the same things, especially if you look at like wooden doors. If you look at wooden doors and stuff like that, you start to notice that they are the same throughout. Now, there used to be this thing in South Africa when they were trying to like lie about the history of Africans and say that Africans didn't even develop doors. But of course, that was a big lie. If you go and look at Dogon and any of these people, not only did they develop doors, but they decorated them almost too much, almost to the point where you using them is more damaging to the art than not using them. The final circle that I have to put in here is the Indian Ocean trade route. Now, of course, there's still more. There's still the Mediterranean trade routes that link Africa to Europe and all this other stuff. But put the triangle, the triangle of East Africa, Arabia, India, and North Africa, Egypt, you'll actually notice that there are some coastal cities, and I'll talk about this in a different video, coastal cities that went down at the same time with the rising of the Indian Ocean. So there's some cities located in the coast of India that went into the water just like at the same time at 0 AD, and that happened at the exact same time in Egypt as well. But that's another video. What we have to look at now is Ghana. So we're going back to 2000 BC in Ghana. And this will tell you again that we are looking at a proper civilization that existed prior to any of the stuff that we're talking about later. We're not talking about Akan or Asante or any of these things yet. It's called the Kintampo village or Kintampo culture. As we read, the village of Kintampo is a Brong Ahafo region, is in the Brong Ahafo region of Ghana. It contains several archaeological sites which were inhabited by Kintampo people between 2000 and 500 BC. Kintampo locals are said to have begun to develop the microlith industry, a microlith being a type of flint tool, and also to have set up intensive hunting, fishing, and food gathering economies. Archaeologists have recovered the bones and teeth of cattle, sheep, and dwarf goats in the area. Evidence of livestock farming, rock shelters, and caves have been excavated, and these are believed to have served as homes for some of the Kintampo people. One of these is the Kintampo Rock Shelter. When excavating this site in 1966 and 67, archaeologist Colin Flight found evidence that locals had used food plants such as hackberry, oil palm, and cowpeas as a food source. The rock shelter also contained the remains of elephants, hippopotami, carnivorous antelopes, duikers, catfish, presumably the spoils of a Kintampo hunting efforts. Now, it's also important to understand that since these people were pastoralists as well, and they also had all these things growing in the same time, food, they also had animals, all these things growing at the same time. This helped and probably developed for them a thing that is similar throughout the entire of West Africa. This thing is the types of dwellings that they built. Again, some made of wood, some made of possibly grass, but that's harder to prove. Some made of mud, and then some made of brick, as we read. Kintampo culture sites. Kintampo culture has been named as a subdivision within the social structure of Stone Age Ghana. There are more than 30 known Kintampo culture sites, 16 of which have been excavated. All of these are to be found in the forest tree savanna and grassland savanna country. The people belonging to the culture lived in the wood, mud, and occasionally stone dwellings. They were pioneers in a number of areas, initiating farming and settled village community life in the country. They are also among the earliest known artists in Ghana, specializing in pottery and producing utensils such as wide mouth bowls, jars, and water pots, often ornamented with comb marks and made in a characteristically simple style. This type of trade specialization was also a new beginning in Ghana and in turn resulted in the initiation with the Kantampo culture of the first organized pottery trading in the country. Some significant Kantampo culture sites are the village of Kantampo itself, from which the term Kantampo culture was taken, Ntereso, Boyase Hill, and Birimi. So starting off, we also need to talk about the Birimi culture. The Birimi is situated in Ghana's northern region between the towns of Gambaga and Nereleju. The site was discovered by Francois Kensey in 1987 during the first archaeological excavation ever attempted in the locality. Birimi appears to have been occupied in intensive ironworking, suggesting the presence of a site of a number of slag mounds and their corresponding iron furnaces. Evidence has also been produced of pearl millet cultivation. Besides this, there have been discoveries of pottery and of structures supposedly lived in by ancient locals, built of densely spaced poles under coverings of fine clay. The next site is Boyose or Boyase Hill. Boyase Hill is to be found in Kumasi on an area of savanna vegetation surrounded by thick forest. Leonard Newton, who was a botanist or botany lecturer of the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, first discovered the site in the 1970s. The village of Boyase Hill, which existed around 2500 BC, was about 500 meters in diameter and was involved in early stone industries as demonstrated by finds of collections of polished stone axes and arrowheads, microliths, stone arm rings, and beads. The site also presents the ancient ruins of stone structures. Archaeologists have come across the clay sculpture of a dog. And finally, we have Ntereso. Ntereso is located to the west of Tamale or Tano in savanna woodland on the ridge above the White Volta. The site was first discovered in 1952 by archaeologist Oliver Davies when the area was excavated in 1961 and 62. Finds include bone harpoons, stone arrowheads, fish hooks, and the remains of local animals such as antelopes, all evidencing a hunting community. It seems in keeping with the Kintampo culture sites that locals also farmed. The site contains evidence of early pastoralism dated to around 2000 BC, including the bone and teeth of dwarf goats. Archaeologists also discovered terracotta figurines of animals such as lizards and cows. So, what exactly can we gain from this before we end the video? Well, there's a couple things. One, you can see that some of these structures that are under these rock shelters are very well made in some way. But also, we can see that there are some similarities between these and the Telem in Mali, which we'll talk about in a different video. But the thing that's most important is that we see that even though these people lived with farming and they lived with the basics of farming, the reality of it, food cropping, and also the animal aspect of it, they still lived in three ways. And I tried to show you that in Africa, it was never one or the other. And I think it's true for a lot of places around the world that the same culture, the same people could be living three different ways at the exact same time. So, for example, I know I've been talking about Egypt a lot in this video, even though it's about West Africa, so don't complain. For example, you see the people in Nubia, in Egypt proper, not Nubia, Egypt proper, they're living with Pangraves at the same time as there are pyramids, at the same time as there are some hunter gatherers. With a start like this, where else could these people possibly go? What else could they possibly discover? Now, I want to remind you again that some of the architecture from this region, as impressive as it is nothing compared to the fact that they had ironwork here before other places around the world. Remember that. It's going to be very important. The farming that operated in Ghana specifically was unique to Ghana in some ways, but also not. It was unique to these parts of West Africa. And we can tell because some of these foods that are domesticated in this region are spread throughout this region, which tells us that these people at least had enough access towards each other to trade goods like food, perhaps even items like weapons and tools for labor. As we read, Kintampo sites within West African sites with archaeobotanical remains from 3rd to 1st millennium Col BC. The arrows indicate directions of pearl millet diffusion into sub-Saharan West Africa, including 4 Kintampo B site and 14 Bosumpra cave. And I want to remind you that not all these people were living exactly the same at this point, and through this trade, they started living more and more similar and started to become or started to take themselves more and more seriously within the farming space and within the greater world. It would lead to these people afterwards. So if we go on another 500 years, 1500 BC, it would lead to these people becoming one of the true influences of North Africa, as we see some of the foods that are from from West Africa making their way into Europe. And then also we find out years later, we're not going to jump that far, but we're going to do it right now. Years later, we find that Romans and Greeks trading in some of the palms in this region. There's something very important as well about this place. It has to do with bananas and it has to do with all these things that you will find all over West Africa, but we'll save that for another time. So let me finish off by saying, yes, it is true. Once history is invented and there are true cool narratives about specific people, it makes it seem like that history is more important than history that we can prove via true dated and hidden or found artifacts. But I promise you, this is more interesting than some story that some person told one time at some place. And the fact that it's way older means that it's more significant. And it means that it's more disconnected with other places outside of Africa. The oceans, the temperatures, the weather, all of this plays a role. And all of these are very interesting and they will tell you things that you never would have expected to know about specific regions within West Africa. You would never expect to know things about specific regions because you just take it as one giant block. Now, before I leave, I want to show one video and I want to show you everybody here that the Bantu languages are very related to the languages of West Africa because of this next video I'm going to show you. There's parts that are obviously not going to match at all, but there's some that are gonna match. It's gonna be like 30-second video, so prepare yourself.
Do you know how to say this in Igbo? My love. Ihunanyam. I love you. Ahurum ginanya. Easy, right? Hug me. There's also Nyemun Susu. Give me a kiss if it's like a peck. And how would you say baby? Mwah. Mwah.